In January of 1904, in a room somewhere in Los Angeles, a coin was tossed. On one side of the table sat Abbot Kinney, tobacco millionaire, world traveler, asthmatic son of a New Jersey farm family who'd made his fortune selling cigarettes in New York before the century turned. On the other side sat his three business partners, men who wanted nothing more than to expand the casino they already owned in Ocean Park, just south of Santa Monica. The partnership was dead. The only question was, who got what? They'd split their holdings, a mile and a half of oceanfront property, with a single flip. The winner would choose first. Kinney called tails. He won. His partners waited for him to take the obvious prize, the developed northern half, with its established resort and paying customers. Kinney chose the swamp. He took the marshy, undeveloped southern parcel, tidal flats and sand dunes that nobody wanted, land that flooded when it rained and stank when it didn't. His partners must have thought he'd lost his mind. He hadn't. He'd been to Venice, Italy. He'd walked the Piazza San Marco and watched gondolas slide beneath stone bridges, and decided, with the calm certainty of a man who had more money than anyone could talk him out of spending, that he would build the whole thing again on a California marsh. Not a reference to Venice, not a tribute, a copy. Canals, gondolas, colonnaded arcades, a Byzantine facade facing the Pacific Ocean. He would call it Venice of America, and it would be dedicated not to amusement, but to culture, opera, lectures, poetry. The masses would come to the beach and stay for the Enlightenment. It was, by any reasonable measure, an insane idea. It was also, for a few brilliant years, one of the most successful real estate developments in the history of Los Angeles. And then it fell apart. And then something else rose in its place. And then that fell apart too. Venice Beach has been doing this for 121 years, building fantasies on sand, watching them collapse, building new ones on the wreckage. And that cycle, that specific rhythm of dream and ruin and dream again, is the reason the place feels the way it does today. It's also the reason nobody can agree on what's wrong with it, because everyone who argues about Venice is really arguing about which version of the fantasy was the real one. Kinney started with mules. In 1904, teams of them began dragging through the muck, digging the first channels. When the animals proved too slow, Kinney brought in steam-powered excavators. He hired over 1,000 workers. He was building 7 canals, nearly 2 miles of waterways, 50 feet wide and 5 feet deep, cut into the tidal marsh. He imported gondolas from Italy and hired actual gondoliers to pole them through the channels. Along the beachfront, he erected a 1,600-foot pleasure pier designed by the architectural firm Marsh & Russell. On it, he placed a 3,400-seat auditorium, a ship-shaped restaurant, a saltwater swimming pool, and a ballroom that cost him $40,000 to build, the finest and largest dance hall on the coast, he said. A 52-member Royal Italian band was engaged to perform. Where the canals met the ocean, he built a central lagoon, roughly where the Windward Circle traffic roundabout sits today. And around it, he erected a block of arcaded commercial buildings done in the Italian Renaissance style, with arched colonnades and ornamental capitals modeled, he told people, on the Doge's palace. Every building in the development had to meet Kinney's design standards. No cheap wood facades, no American vernacular. If you were going to build in Venice of America, your building would look Venetian, or you wouldn't build. 2 brutal storms hit in February and March of 1905 and destroyed the pier before a single visitor had set foot on it. Kinney didn't blink. His army of workers rebuilt it in 4 months. On July 4th, 1905, Venice of America opened. Electric trolley cars ran frequent service from downtown Los Angeles, 16 miles to the east. Between 40,000 and 50,000 people showed up on opening day. They rode the gondolas, they walked the colonnades, They stared at the canals, which had been filled with ocean water pumped in through channels to the sea. They watched yacht races. They listened to band performances. They rode a miniature railroad. Fireworks exploded over the Pacific. It was, by every account, astonishing. An Italian fantasy dropped onto the edge of the ocean, backed by sand dunes and chaparral, accessible by streetcar for a nickel fare. Nothing like it existed anywhere in America. Kinney's Folly, the papers had been calling it. After opening day, nobody called it that. And then Kinney tried to make them listen to lectures. He had founded an organization called the Venice Assembly, patterned after the Chautauqua movement back east. He brought in professors, writers, intellectuals. The lectures were held in the great auditorium on the pier. They were, by his own later admission, a disaster. Attendance was thin. The summer season ended with a loss of $16,000 on the assembly alone. The people who rode the trolley from Los Angeles didn't want to hear about philosophy. They wanted rides, sideshows, noise, the same things they could get at any amusement pier up and down the coast. Only here, the setting was better. Kinney, to his credit, understood this quickly. He didn't fight the market. He gave the people what they wanted. He added a miniature steam railroad. He expanded the pier with amusement rides. He brought in carnival attractions, built a roller coaster, added an ostrich farm and a zoological garden and a skating rink. By 1910, Venice of America was drawing visitors by the hundreds of thousands. In 1914, the Kinney Company spent another $100,000 expanding the pier, adding a free parking lot for 700 automobiles. But the canals, the actual physical fact that made this place Venice, and not just another stretch of California boardwalk, were always the problem. They didn't circulate properly. The tidal flow was poor. The water stagnated. Sewage backed up. Maintaining them cost thousands of dollars a year in dredging alone, and the salt water corroded everything it touched. The canals were Kinney's great romantic gesture, and they were also, from the very beginning, an engineering headache. He kept them running through force of will and force of money. As long as Abbot Kinney was alive, the canals had a patron. He died on November 4th, 1920, lung cancer, 69 years old. A tobacco millionaire killed by his own product. Exactly 46 days later, on December 20th, 1920, the pier caught fire. It started in the dance hall. The flames spread so fast that the band reportedly played a rousing march to rally the guests through an orderly evacuation, the music rising over the sound of the fire as the building came apart above them. A firefighter named Arthur Harlan was killed when the wall of the Ocean Inn collapsed on top of him. By morning, the pier was a smoldering ruin. Only the newly built roller coaster and the bandstand tower survived. The pier was rebuilt and reopened by May of 1921, but the message was hard to miss. Kinney was dead, and 6 weeks later, so was his pier. The Venice he'd dreamed into existence had lost its author. What followed was a collapse that moved with terrible speed. Without Kinney, the infrastructure fell apart. The roads crumbled. The water and sewage systems, never adequate, failed. The canals, no longer dredged by a millionaire's checkbook, turned stagnant and foul. Venice was still an independent city, technically. It had its own board of trustees, its own police, but it couldn't govern itself. It couldn't afford to. By 1925, the roads, water, and sewage systems were in such disrepair that annexation to Los Angeles was put to a vote. It was close. Opponents argued that Venice would lose its identity, its independence, its amusement revenue. Supporters, some of them, according to local accounts, recent arrivals from L.A. who had moved to Venice specifically to vote, carried the day. In November 1925, Venice voted itself out of existence and became a neighborhood of Los Angeles. Los Angeles had annexed the Disneyland of its day, and it immediately set about dismantling it. Kinney's son Thornton, who now ran the family company, would later explain it with a line that belongs in a museum of American real estate cynicism. Venice was a dream city, and without sentiment it could not be built. But financial calculations suffocate sentiment, and the march of time and progress of the community demanded sentiment be stifled. LA's blue laws banned gambling, banned all-night dancing, banned Sunday amusements. Tourists abandoned Venice for Santa Monica, where no such restrictions existed. 1/3 of Venice's businesses closed. And then the city looked at the canals and saw not romance, but mosquitoes, stagnant water, and an obstacle to the automobile. Cars were the future, canals were the past. Over the furious objections of canal residents, the city began filling them in. The first truckloads of dirt arrived on November 15, 1927. A court battle dragged on for 3 years. The residents lost. By 1929, most of the original canals, the ones Kinney had dug with mules and steam shovels, the ones the gondoliers had poled through on opening day, were paved over and turned into streets. The lagoon at the center of Kinney's plan, the heart of his Venice, was filled in and became a traffic circle. 6 canals in a separate subdivision to the south survived, but only because they were in a different tract and the city hadn't gotten to them yet. Those 6 canals, Carroll, Linney, Howland, Sherman, Eastern, and Grand, still exist today. The homes along them sell for $3 to $5 million. But in 1929, the canals weren't the biggest news in Venice. Something else had been discovered under the sand. On December 18, 1929, the Ohio Oil Company completed a well just east of the Grand Canal. It came in producing 3,000 barrels a day. 3,000 barrels of crude oil gushing out of the ground in what had been, 24 years earlier, Abbot Kinney's Venetian paradise. The news spread through Venice like the fire had spread through the pier. Residents mobbed City Hall, demanding that their neighborhoods be rezoned to allow drilling. This was the Depression, after all. People needed money. By June of 1930, the rapidly expanding oil field was producing $75,000 a week. By September, 50 wells were operating, and the coastline had been transformed into an industrial nightmare. By 1931, the Venice oil field had grown to 340 wells and become the 4th most productive in California. The 148 initial wells were pulling out nearly 47,000 barrels a day, plus 2 million cubic feet of natural gas. Oil waste flooded the lagoons. The remaining canals turned black with sludge. Schools near the wells were closed for safety reasons. The beach where 50,000 people had once showed up on a July afternoon to ride gondolas through an Italian fantasy, was horribly polluted. Derricks stood in rows along the sand, their legs sometimes overlapping like the bones of some industrial forest. Where children had ridden a miniature railroad past arched colonnades, roughnecks now pulled 12-hour shifts. The canals that Kinney had dug to evoke the waterways of the Adriatic now stank of petroleum. The field depleted quickly, as shallow coastal fields tend to do. By 1932, production was already dropping. By 1942, the 340 wells had pumped a cumulative total of roughly 47.5 million barrels, but daily output was down to 688 barrels. The derricks came down slowly. 64 remained in 1959, and the last one wasn't removed until 1962. But the damage was done. Venice had gone from Italian fantasy to seaside resort to oil field in less than 30 years. Kinney's arcaded buildings, the ones still standing, now fronted a neighborhood that stank of crude and looked like the aftermath of something. If you had told someone in 1910, standing on the pier listening to the Royal Italian Band while gondolas glided below, that within 2 decades this same stretch of coast would be a forest of oil derricks pumping black sludge through the canals, they would not have believed you. But it happened. Everything in Venice happens. The post-war years brought a new Venice, and as usual it was built on the ruins of the old one. The oil was gone. The amusement piers were gone. LA's blue laws had banned all-night dancing and Sunday entertainment after annexation, and 1/3 of Venice's businesses had closed as tourists fled to unrestricted Santa Monica. The grand colonnaded buildings along Windward Avenue, the ones Kinney had modeled on the Doge's palace, were shabby and half-empty. Rents were cheap. The neighborhood was run down, unfashionable, largely forgotten by the rest of Los Angeles. Which made it, of course, perfect. By the mid-1950s, Venice had become the West Coast capital of the beat generation. The low rents, the street-level tolerance, the year-round fine weather, the proximity to the ocean, everything that made Venice a failed resort made it an ideal bohemian colony. A poet named Lawrence Lipton, born in Poland, raised in Chicago, 4 times married, a former writer of detective stories and screenplays who had reinvented himself as a champion of the counterculture, settled in Venice with his 4th wife, Nettie, and declared the neighborhood the true home of the beats. Not San Francisco's North Beach, not New York's Greenwich Village, Venice. He called it that horizontal jerry-built slum by the sea. He meant it as a compliment. Lipton held court. He organized readings where poets performed to live jazz. He attracted young artists, dropouts, seekers, and hangers-on, the whole taxonomy of the 50s underground. The Venice West Cafe on Dudley Avenue became the gathering place. In 1959, Lipton published The Holy Barbarians, a book that chronicled the Venice beat scene and helped create the enduring public image of the beatnik, the bearded nonconformist in a black turtleneck, snapping his fingers to bongo drums. The book was widely read. It turned Venice into a tourist attraction of a different kind. People came to gawk at the beatniks the way they'd once come to ride the gondolas. Life magazine ran features. Television crews showed up. Lipton, who had a talent for self-promotion that rivaled Kinney's, positioned himself as the movement's spokesman and Venice as its headquarters. The media called him the king of the beatniks, and he didn't argue. The beat era in Venice was brief and combustible. By the early 60s, it was already fading, overwhelmed by its own publicity and by the harder-edged counterculture that was rising to replace it. Stuart Perkoff, the most gifted poet in the Venice scene, more talented than Lipton, most agreed, destroyed himself with heroin. Others drifted away. But the beat years left a permanent mark on Venice's identity. After the beats, Venice was never again just a beach town. It was a place where outsiders gathered, where the rules were different, where the normal codes of Los Angeles, car culture, suburban conformity, real estate ambition, didn't apply. That reputation, once established, proved impossible to erase. The summer of 1965 may have been the most consequential in Venice's history, and nobody knew it at the time. 2 things happened within weeks of each other, and they had nothing to do with each other, and they both changed the world. In early July, a 21-year-old UCLA film school graduate named Jim Morrison was living on a friend's rooftop at a Venice address, writing poems, hanging around the beatnik cafes, taking acid, barely eating. He'd recently shed 30 pounds and looked, by multiple accounts, like a different person. On or around July 8th, he was walking along the beach near Venice when he ran into a former classmate named Ray Manzarek, who was sitting on the sand meditating. Manzarek asked what Morrison had been doing. Morrison said he'd been writing songs. He sang a few lines of something called Moonlight Drive. Right there, on the sand, Manzarek heard something he recognized as extraordinary and told Morrison they should start a band. Morrison moved into Manzarek's tiny apartment in nearby Ocean Park. Within months, they had recruited Robbie Krieger and John Densmore. They called themselves the Doors. Within 2 years, they would be one of the biggest rock bands in America. The sun, the sand, the wind, the shining moon, the boundlessness of Venice Beach, all of it was in the music from the start. A few weeks later, in August, a bodybuilder named Joe Gold opened a gym in a cinder block building at 1006 Pacific Avenue. Gold was the son of a junk dealer, a former merchant marine, a man who had been dissatisfied with the ad hoc outdoor gyms that Southern California's bodybuilding community had been using since the 1930s. The original Muscle Beach, where gymnasts and acrobats had performed on equipment installed by the WPA during the Depression, was in Santa Monica, and it had been shut down in 1959 after allegations of sexual misconduct among some of its regulars. In 1951, Venice had set up its own outdoor weightlifting platform, a small fenced pen near Windward Avenue known simply as the Pen. Gold decided to build something better. He'd been buying beachfront properties in Venice for small sums, real estate that respectable investors wouldn't touch, and he converted one of them, a building on Pacific Avenue, into a gym. He welded his own equipment out of scrap metal, the son of a junk dealer turning junk into barbells. He didn't bother much with heating. He charged $60 a year. He called it Gold's Gym. Within a few years, a 21-year-old Austrian immigrant named Arnold Schwarzenegger walked through the door, and the history of fitness culture pivoted on the spot. Here is what Venice produced in a single decade: The Doors and Gold's Gym. The defining rock band of the 60s counterculture and the foundational institution of the modern fitness industry. Both born on the same strip of sand, both built by outsiders who came to Venice because it was cheap and strange and nobody told you how to live. Both impossible to imagine anywhere else. But Venice was also producing something darker in those same years. At the border between Venice and Santa Monica, an old amusement park called Pacific Ocean Park, POP everyone called it, was dying. Built in 1958 on the bones of the old Ocean Park Pier as a competitor to Disneyland, POP had 28 acres of rides and attractions extending out into the Pacific. It failed. Attendance dropped. The park went bankrupt in 1967. The rides were auctioned off. The structures were shuttered. And then the fires started. On December 29, 1969, an arson blaze hit the seaward end of the pier. On May 27, 1970, a midnight fire destroyed the Aragon Ballroom and the Lick Pier while thousands watched. Onshore winds carried leaping embers 1,000 feet to nearby Venice buildings. Young transients, as many as 12 to 20, had been living in the abandoned structures and under the pier. Some were suspected of setting the fires. Some were missing afterward. Because the fire burned so hot, no bodies were ever found. Pop's skeleton, the ruined pilings, the crumbling concrete, the ghostly half-submerged remains of a family amusement park, became the most dangerous surf break in Southern California. The huge wooden pilings formed a U-shaped cove, and the local surfers who discovered it guarded it with their fists. Outsiders who paddled in were warned once, then beaten. The area around the ruins, the ragged blocks between Venice and Santa Monica, became known as Dogtown. And Dogtown, in 1971, produced the next impossible thing that Venice is famous for. That year, a surfer named Jeff Ho, along with Skip Engblom and Craig Stietzig, opened a shop called Jeff Ho Surfboards and Zephyr Productions on the corner of Bay Street and Main Street in Santa Monica, at the northern edge of Dogtown. They sponsored a surf team made up of local teenagers, kids from broken homes, aggressive, antisocial, fiercely territorial. The first member was a 14-year-old named Nathan Pratt. By 1974, the roster included Jay Adams, Tony Alva, Chris Cahill, Stacy Peralta, and Alan Sarlo. They called themselves the Zephyr Team, or the Z-Boys. They surfed the ruins of Pop with a reckless, low center of gravity style that nobody else could match. In 1975, Southern California was deep in a drought. Homeowners drained their swimming pools. The Z-Boys, kids from broken homes, kids who had nothing, realized that those empty pools, the kidney-shaped ones with the smooth, curved walls, could be skated the same way they surfed the waves at the Cove. They broke into backyards in Brentwood and Bel Air and the Pacific Palisades, the wealthy neighborhoods in the hills above Venice. They dropped in. They invented vertical skateboarding, the explosive, gravity-defying style that would become the foundation of the sport as it exists today. At the 1975 Bond Cadillac National Championships at Del Mar, the Zephyr team showed up in matching blue T-shirts and destroyed the competition. Skateboarding, as a recognizable modern subculture, the boards, the fashion, the attitude, the defiance, was born in the ruins of a bankrupt amusement park on the border of Venice, California. Craig Stisek photographed and wrote about it. Stacy Peralta later directed a documentary about it. A Hollywood film called Lords of Dogtown dramatized it. But the essential fact is simpler than any of that. A group of teenagers from broken homes with nothing to lose and nowhere else to go invented a global sport in the drained swimming pools of neighborhoods they could never afford to live in. Built, once again, on wreckage. The same decade brought the golden age of Muscle Beach, Venice. Arnold Schwarzenegger was training at Gold's Gym 6 days a week. Franco Columbu, Lou Ferrigno, Dave Draper, the great bodybuilders of the era worked out in the weight pen and on the sand while tourists gathered to watch. In 1977, the documentary Pumping Iron brought cameras into Gold's Gym and put Venice bodybuilding culture on movie screens worldwide. Arnold's presence turned the neighborhood into a pilgrimage site. In 1987, the city of Los Angeles officially dedicated the outdoor facility as Muscle Beach, Venice, adding the word Venice to distinguish it from the original Muscle Beach in Santa Monica, which by then existed only as a plaque south of the Santa Monica Pier. Through all of this, the Beats, the Doors, the Z-Boys, Gold's Gym, Arnold, Venice remained cheap. That was the essential fact. The neighborhood that Abbot Kinney had built as a showcase of European sophistication was, by the 1970s and 1980s, one of the most affordable places on the Los Angeles West Side. The Oakwood section, a historically African-American and Latino neighborhood a few blocks inland from the boardwalk, was turf for the Venice Shoreline Crips and the V-13 gang. Shootings were common. Drug markets operated openly. The streets that Kinney had laid out for strolling tourists in white linen were now places where you kept your head down after dark. The remaining canals, the 6 that had survived the 1929 paving, were in terrible shape. By 1940, the sidewalks along them had become unsafe. By the 1970s, the canals were essentially open sewers. Nobody with money wanted to live there. Property values were low. And because property values were low, artists and surfers and bodybuilders and musicians and people who didn't fit anywhere else could afford to be there. Venice's poverty was the precondition for its creativity. This is a pattern visible in neighborhoods all over America. New York's Soho, San Francisco's Mission District, Chicago's Wicker Park. But in Venice, the cycle ran with particular ferocity, because Venice was beachfront. Cheap beachfront property in Los Angeles is an anomaly that cannot last, and everyone who benefited from it knew at some level that the clock was running. The turn came in the early 1990s. In 1990, the old West Washington Boulevard was renamed Abbot Kinney Boulevard, honoring the man who had started everything with a coin toss 86 years earlier. The street was already beginning to attract small galleries, bakeries, bookshops, the kind of independent businesses that signal a neighborhood on the rise. 2 years later, in 1992, the long-neglected surviving canals finally received the restoration they'd needed for decades. A $12 million project drained the canals, rebuilt the sidewalks and footbridges, and installed new banks. Property owners along the canals paid assessments of $6,000 to $8,000 over 10 years. When the work was finished in 1993, the Venice Canals Association held a carnival to celebrate and rented 2 gondolas from Naples, a neighborhood in Long Beach, to give rides, just like 1905. By the time the gondolas hit the water, the restored canals had already begun to attract buyers. The houses that had been worth almost nothing in the 1970s began to appreciate, slowly at first, then not slowly at all. The gentrification of Venice is one of the most dramatic in American urban history. By the 2000s, the bungalows and cottages along the canals, houses that had sat in decaying, unfashionable obscurity for half a century, were selling for over $1 million, then $2 million, then $3 million. The streets around Abbot Kinney Boulevard followed. In 2012, GQ magazine declared Abbot Kinney Boulevard the coolest block in America, a designation that functioned less as a celebration than as a starting gun. Restaurants opened, boutiques opened, property values spiked. A mixed-use property on the boulevard listed at $4.7 million. The median home price in Venice climbed past $2.5 million. Venice, the swamp that Kinney had won in a coin toss, became one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Los Angeles, tied with Bel Air by one measure in price per square foot. And then came the tech companies. Google established a presence on the West Side. Snapchat, founded in 2011 by Stanford graduates in their early 20s, set up headquarters on the Venice Boardwalk in 2013. The area between Venice, Santa Monica, and Playa Vista became known as Silicon Beach, home to more than 500 tech startups, plus outposts of YouTube, Yahoo, BuzzFeed, and Amazon. Snap Incorporated alone eventually controlled roughly 605,000 square feet of office space along the LA County coastline. Local activists mapped 23 properties they said Snap either leased or owned in Venice. The company was converting residential spaces and displacing local businesses. Teen Project, a non-profit that helped homeless teenagers, lost its space to Snap's expansion. Venetians marched in the street. Posters appeared in windows. Hashtag Keep Venice Weird. Hashtag Snap Out of It. Hashtag Delete Snapchat. A longtime resident named Mike Bravo, whose family had lived in the same Venice house since the 1930s, called Snap a hyper-example of the gluttonous gentrification that's been going on in the neighborhood. The protests didn't stop the expansion. Eventually, Snap moved much of its operation to a corporate office park in Santa Monica. But by then the damage, or the transformation, depending on who you asked, was done. Venice office rents had hit $7 a square foot. Vacancy rates hovered around 10%. The neighborhood that had been cheap enough for beatniks and bodybuilders was now priced for software engineers. The homeless crisis arrived, or more accurately, it had always been there, but it became impossible to ignore. Venice had been a magnet for transients and drifters since at least the 1960s, when young runaways squatted in the ruins of Pacific Ocean Park. But the scale of what happened in 2020 was different. When the pandemic hit and the city of Los Angeles, following public health guidance, stopped enforcing its ordinances against camping in public places, people set up tents on the Venice Boardwalk, and they stayed. By the summer of 2021, roughly 200 tents lined the oceanfront, the same 2.5-mile promenade where tourists had walked past fortune tellers and street performers and bodybuilders for decades. A January 2020 count by the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority had found nearly 2,000 unhoused people in Venice, out of a total neighborhood population of about 35,000. That represented a 57% increase over the previous year, far outpacing the 16% increase citywide. The boardwalk became something out of a dystopian film. Tents packed together along the concrete path, needles on the ground, the smell of urine competing with suntan lotion, as one reporter wrote. Fires inside encampments, shootings. A man shot on April 28, 2021, survived. An explosion inside an encampment caused a fire in May. Residents who had lived in Venice for 20 years said it was the worst they'd ever seen. John Betts, a Venice resident, told a news crew, "It's the worst I've seen in 20 years." Karen Kitchell, who lived a few blocks from the boardwalk, said she was afraid to walk to Gold's Gym, the same Gold's Gym that Joe Gold had opened with scrap metal equipment in 1965, the gym where Arnold had trained, the mecca of bodybuilding, now surrounded by tents. City officials fought over what to do. L.A. City Councilman Mike Bonham, who represented the district, drew fury from residents who felt he wasn't acting fast enough. Sheriff Alex Villanueva vowed to clean up the encampments by July 4th. Outreach workers from the nonprofit St. Joseph Center went tent by tent, offering housing and services. In January 2023, the new mayor, Karen Bass, launched the Inside Safe program, sending teams to dismantle encampments and move people into motel rooms. The tents came down. According to the LAPD, crime around the former encampment sites on 3rd Street and Hampton Drive dropped nearly 24% in the first quarter of 2023 compared to the previous year. Around the boardwalk, the drop was even more dramatic. But a 2023 RAND Corporation study found that the total number of unhoused people in Venice had actually increased by about 5%, even as the visible encampments shrank. The tents were gone, the people were not. Nearly half of Venice's unhoused population in 2023 had no shelter of any kind, no tent, no car, nothing, up from 20% in 2021 and 2022. The crisis had become less visible without becoming less real. Walk Venice today and you see all of it at once, layered on top of itself like an archaeological dig turned sideways. The surviving colonnade along Windward Avenue, a few arches left over from Kinney's Italian fantasy, the ones that property owners fought to save when the city's urban renewal agency tried to demolish them. The traffic circle at Windward, where the central lagoon used to be, where gondoliers once poled beneath pedestrian bridges in 1905. The weight pen at Muscle Beach, with its plate-loaded barbells worn smooth by decades of use, and its Hall of Fame plaques listing names that any bodybuilder in the world would recognize. The skate park on the beach opened in 2009 after years of activism, built on the site of the old pavilion where kids had been skating on plywood ramps since the 70s. Abbot Kinney Boulevard, with its $40 entrees and its $700 sneakers, and its real estate offices selling bungalows for $3 million. The canals, restored, beautiful, lined with homes that no gondolier could afford, the water about a foot deep, and home to ducks and kayaks and the occasional paddleboard. And the boardwalk, ocean front walk, 2.5 miles of concrete where you can still find a fortune teller, a man playing electric guitar on roller skates, someone selling henna tattoos from a card table. But quieter now, fewer vendors, fewer tourists, fewer of the street performers who once made the boardwalk feel like an open-air circus. More empty storefronts, more wariness. The neighborhood that drew 16 million visitors a year, second only to Disneyland in Southern California, feels on certain afternoons like a place that isn't sure what it's supposed to be anymore. This has happened before. This has, in fact, happened 5 or 6 times. Kinney's intellectual resort became an amusement pier, became a broken-down oil field, became a beatnik enclave, became a bodybuilding mecca, became a skateboarding birthplace, became the coolest block in America, became a tech campus, became a tent city. Each version of Venice erased the last one. Each one was declared, while it was happening, to be the authentic Venice, the real thing. And each one turned out to be as temporary as the gondolas on the canal. The canals are the oldest surviving thing. Not the original canals, those were paved over, asphalt laid on top of the water that Kinney's mules dug out of the marsh. The surviving canals, the ones in the southern tract, the ones that were almost an afterthought when they were built, those are what endure. They were neglected for 40 years and then restored for $12 million. And now the houses along them sell for more than Kinney spent building all of Venice of America. The canals that were supposed to be the copy, the imitation of the Italian original, have become the most genuine thing the neighborhood has. The arched colonnades along Windward, the ones Kinney designed to look like the Doge's palace, lost most of their upper stories decades ago. But a few columns still stand. They hold up nothing. They support no weight. They are decorative remnants of a fantasy that a man dreamed up after winning a coin toss. And they have outlasted the oil derricks and the amusement rides and the beatnik cafes and the tent encampments and every other thing that was supposed to replace them. Abbot Kinney's name is on a boulevard where a coffee costs $7 and a house costs $3 million. and his canals are full of ducks, and his pier is gone, and his gondoliers are gone, and his Royal Italian Band is gone, and the marsh he drained is the most expensive sand in California. The coin came up tails.